All right. Let me just begin by very briefly telling you what we're going to be doing this week. Of course, it's on the syllabus, but give you a better idea. I'm going to be speaking about Mao and the history of China from the second half of the 19th century. And I want to reiterate what I've mentioned to you several times, including Friday, the last lecture, which is that some of the detail here is being given to you for your information. You're not expected to know this detail, and you're not going to get tested on it because you don't even have the readings. But in order for you to understand the evolution, in this case, for example, today, of Chinese communism and how we got to that position, how we got to that state in China, it's important to understand what transpired very, very briefly in the second half of the 19th century. So we're going to be speaking about that, and then we're going to move to the whole question of ideologies in the first half of the 20th century. And in principle, what we're looking at here is National Socialism or Fascism, the other name by which it's known. We won't have time to really look at totalitarianism in the Soviet Union, because one of the things that's going to happen in the Soviet Union, particularly after the passing of Lenin, which is only really a few years after the Bolshevik Revolution, that power is going to be assumed. There's going to be a struggle within the Soviet Communist Party, and Stalin is going to emerge triumphant in that struggle. And as I'm sure some of you know, he's going to have basically a stranglehold on the Soviet Union until nearly his death. And what's going to transpire during that is not only the whole course of World War II, where the Soviet Union is going to suffer massive, massive casualties, far more so than any other country in the world, far more so than Germany or Japan, for that matter. But what's also going to happen is things such as what is called the collectivization of Russian agriculture. So this was an attempt for the Soviet Union to catch up with the West. And Stalin took the view that any price would be paid to do that. And so, of course, lives were going to be sacrificed. Millions of lives were going to be sacrificed. This is something that the left in countries such as the United States and Britain, for example, didn't fully understand or fully acknowledge for the first several years, maybe even for a decade. But certainly by the mid-1930s, it was quite apparent what was transpiring in the Soviet Union. You also had a famine in the Ukraine. So you've got several million casualties. And it's a totalitarian system because when we speak of a totalitarian system, what we're really speaking about is a system that doesn't really allow, to put it very, very mildly, simply doesn't allow for obviously freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and all of that. But the state is watching you. You know, when we start to look at these ideologies, there are interesting questions as to in what respect totalitarianism was different from fascism, in what respect it was similar. And one of the ways in which you can look at this is that you can look at the relationship of either system to capitalism, because we find, and I'm going to show you slides as well of that, we find that the Nazis were extremely hospitable to capitalism, but a totalitarian system isn't, of course. And in fact, there were very close links between the Nazi leadership and the major American capitalists of the day. All right, so there are ways in which one can describe that, but we're not going to have the luxury of being able to look at totalitarianism. We're looking really at National Socialism here. And that's going to be the subject of the lecture on Wednesday for the most part, but I'm going to try to begin with that today. And the other principal subject for this week is the question of nonviolence. It's not perhaps accidental that the most violent century of our times, of history, perhaps in some respects, there may have been periods which were much more violent in the pre-modern period. But certainly if you're looking at the 20th century, what you're looking at is a century of what is called total war, right? Where nothing is spared. And of course, it's a century when you also have the atomic bombings, which again we're going to look at in very substantial detail particularly the first atomic bombing of Hiroshima, although there is a second one of Nagasaki as well, 3 days later in August of 1945. So it's not accidental that the century that produced total war is also the century that produced, and perforce it had to, the most creative responses to violence. And that, of course, is the whole idea of sustained non-violent resistance, which is what we're going to see in India under Mahatma Gandhi, and then, of course, we're going to see a different iteration of that in the United States when you have the civil rights movement under the leadership of Martin Luther King and a number of other people. Right? So that's essentially what we're looking at in this week. Is we're really looking, for the most part, there's some amount of bracketing. In the case of China, we're also looking at slightly early period. For the most part, we're really looking at the interwar years. We're looking at the period between 1918 and the end of World War II. Now, you recall that it's been a while since we were in China. It's been a couple of weeks. And when we last spoke about China, what we were speaking about was the Second Opium War, which concluded in 1860. I had shown you a slide which shows the destruction of the old summer palace. Tianjin, also known as Tianjin, but Tianjin is the other name by which it's known, the anglicized form, and Peking are going to be captured by the British and the French. And that's going to bring an end to the Second Opium War of 1860. There are 6 ports that are going to be ceded to the British. You remember that there were concessions, substantial number of concessions at the end of the First Opium War, 1838 to 41. There are going to be more concessions, and the country is going to be opened up to missionaries. And there's going to be a substantial increase. And once again, take your mind back. You can look at the slides. Take your mind back to the chart I had shown you, where I had shown the increase in opium trade at the end of the Second Opium War, right? And of course, it was this whole trade in opium which precipitated what becomes known as the First and Second Opium Wars. All right. Now, in 1850, this is before the Second Opium War begins, you have the commencement of what is known as the Taiping Rebellion. Okay, this is led by a man, and again, recall what I've been saying. Once more, I'm going to repeat it. Don't get too worried by the detail. The detail is for your information, so you have some background here. So it's led by a man called Hong Shu-guan, who's born in Guangzhou on China's southeast coast. He takes the state civil services exam 4 times, fails it 4 times, comes into contact with Protestant missionaries in 1836. He comes to believe that he is the half-brother of Jesus Christ, and that he had a mission to deliver China from evil. So you can, the minute you see that, you know that this is a man who's got these ecstatic visions, who claims that he's in contact with the divine. You know, people like him surface from time to time in many countries. And you can think of this as a millenarian movement. So when I say a millenarian movement, you know, it's the onset of a new kind of millennium, Messiah, all of that, right? He calls himself the Heavenly Emperor, and his sect would be called the Taipings. So he acquires a large following, and he's going to be preaching largely against the Qing dynasty, which is, of course, the other name by which it's known as the Manchus, right? Now, in areas that came under his control, it's a very large following, and there's actually a very substantial amount of scholarship that's been done in recent years. The Confucian order is attacked, and of course it was that same Confucian order which had, so to speak, failed him, because remember, he took the civil service exam 4 times and failed it, and the civil service exam is something that goes back to the Confucian period. This rebellion is going to last for, as I said, about 14-15 years. He's also going to ban opium smoking. And in 1853, Hong's army is going to inflict a considerable defeat on the Qing dynasty army, and he's actually going to establish a capital. It's going to be a short-lived capital, but he establishes one in Nanking, later to become notorious for what are called the Nanking massacres or the rape of Nanking, which is a city just west of Shanghai. The Europeans threw their support behind the Qing dynasty, all right? And there's a complicated set of maneuvers, but to cut a long story short, what you're going to find is that eventually, given the European support as well, this rebellion is going to, the support is behind the Qing dynasty, this rebellion is going to be eventually crushed by 1864. Now, the gist of all of this is what you see, and this is important because it indicates what's going to happen, so to speak, in the early part of the 20th century. You are beginning to see the disintegration of Confucian Chinese civilization. That is a civilization which for a very long period of time had been based on the Confucian order. Right? That's what you're really beginning to see. You're beginning to see attacks on the state system, exam system. You're going to begin to see attacks on the gentry. And it is in this respect we can think of Mao as inheriting this kind of worldview and you can think of Chinese communism as creating its own messiah, of course, right? Just as he was a messiah, Hong was a messiah, Chinese communism is going to create its own messiah, and that, of course, is Mao himself, right? Now, as we move on into, and of course, what's happening in the interim decades is that you have an increase in the opium trade. You've got a large number of Western goods being dumped on China because these ports have now been opened, not just to Britain and France and the United States, but a large number of European countries. And of course, Japan is starting to get interested in China as well. In 1898, you have what is called the Boxer Rebellion, which really begins as an anti-Manchu rebellion. So it's against the dominant dynasty of that time. But partially because of the adroit work of the Empress Dowager, this is going to become an anti-foreign rebellion. It's going to be transformed into an anti-foreign rebellion. And what you're going to have is you're going to have an alliance of 8 countries, European powers and Japan, which are going to defeat the Chinese. Now, China never was a country that was formally under colonial rule, as we have seen. But if you go back to the First Opium War, the Second War, and then you go to the Boxer Rebellion, it's very clear that China obviously came under spheres of European influence. So there's a question which we are not addressing here, but it's a question for you to mull over, and that is that it's very clear that even though China was not formally under colonial rule, in what respects might we say that China was actually colonized, right? That's an interesting question for historians to address as well. And it's a question that Tagore addresses in one of the readings that I've given to you and which I've spoken to you about before. So this 8-nation alliance is going to defeat the Chinese. They're going to impose an indemnity. So indemnity is reparations, right, that China has to pay. And these European countries are going to have the right to post foreign troops in Tianjin and Peking. And you know that when a country has the right to post foreign troops in another country, that is a sure sign of its colonization in some respects. Right? All right. So this is essentially the history of China in the second half of the 19th century in a capsule form. And then we move into the 20th century, because this is, of course, what's going to lead straight away to Chinese communism. In the last decade of the 19th century, Sun Yat-Sen emerges. He's an educated Chinese. He forms a revolutionary society in 1898. Now, these revolutionary societies, there were several such revolutionary societies, and it's important to understand why these revolutionary societies come about. The reason they come about, in part, is because it was nearly impossible. These are secret societies. It was nearly impossible for these political groups to function in the open. Larger political organizations were banned under the Manchus anyhow, and the Manchus or the Qing dynasty had a very extensive system of spies and surveillance. right? So, but he forms this secret society in 1898, and in the early years, these societies are much more important in the urban coastal areas, right? In 1911, he's going to lead a revolutionary alliance, and that is really the beginning of the end of the imperial system, more or less, because you can see from the slide here that you have the abdication of Puyi. He's the Manchu boy emperor, so there's a long history of how he came to power. But in 1912, he's going to abdicate, and that's going to be the end of the Qing dynasty. And now historians of China who have looked at the second decade and the third decade are aware of the fact that the history of that period is an extremely convoluted period. It's extremely convoluted history because what you're really talking about is the emergence of eventually what is going to become a civil war, and you're going to have a large number of warlords who are going to be competing for power. World War I, it's 1914. 1915, you have what is called the presentation of 21 demands by Japan on China. And you had a reading, a primary document, which essentially stipulates what these demands were. And again, you have to go back to some of the earlier lectures in which I had pointed out to you the advance of Japan, the defeat inflicted on Russia by Japan in 1905. So it's not a surprise that Japan is now emerging as a major imperial power. And we have seen that, of course, in Japan, all of this really begins to transpire in the years after what is called the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s. Right? So Japan, in other words, by the early part of the 20th century, by the very, very early part of the 20th century, is now a major industrial military power. And that, of course, is important to understand how it would eventually evolve into a major and aggressive, extremely aggressive power in the 20s, 30s, and leading, of course, into the 40s until the defeat of Japan and its unconditional surrender to the Americans in 1945, in August 1945. But that's a story that we take up later. For the time being, what are these 21 demands that are imposed upon China by Japan? Japan insists that China stop leasing its territory to other foreign powers. So what is it doing? If you think about it, it's doing exactly, in a sense, what the United States had done when it imposed its Monroe Doctrine in the early part of the 19th century, because the Monroe Doctrine was, hey, the Western Hemisphere, we don't want Europe interfering, this is our domain. Now, essentially, Japan, I mean, one of the ways in which you can think about the 21 demands is it's Japan's version of its Monroe Doctrine, that this is our sphere of the world, we have rights over China before any of the European powers have such rights, right? So it wants China to cede a number of areas, including Shandong. These demands are sent in April of 1915. They give the Chinese a 10 days ultimatum to agree, and 1 day before the end of the ultimatum, China capitulates. So what do they agree to? They agree to give Japanese full rights of residence, ownership, business transactions, farming, this purchase of land in South Manchuria and eastern Inner Mongolia. So you've got substantial chunks of China which have now essentially lost sovereignty completely. That's what it is. It's one way to think about it. This is a word that I haven't used often. I've used it one or two times before. But you can think about all of these struggles, obviously, as struggles for sovereignty, right? So this is an indication of the fact that the Chinese, as I said, have lost their sovereignty. And China agrees that before it's going to allow other foreign consultants, that is to say, non-Japanese, foreign consultants, experts, and businessmen, it would consult with Japan. Right? So essentially, it's saying to the Japanese that, well, you really have rights to determine our political future in some respects. And it's been argued that these demands would have been even heftier but for the fact that the United States and the United Kingdom
were applying some pressure, so there were some kind of restraint that Japan had to exercise. For example, one of the demands was that China would have to accept foreign policy advisors, and so this demand is eventually not agreed upon, partially because of the pressure applied by the US and the UK. And the reason they're applying the pressure, of course, is because they understand what Japanese intentions in the Pacific are, and they're worried about Japan now becoming the hegemonic power in this part of the world. Okay, so it's in the midst of all of this that we can start to think about the emergence of Mao. All right. Now, let me say as a little footnote that for many years, especially in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the main source for the life of Mao and what Mao had been doing was a book written by an American journalist. If you ever catch hold of it, it's a wonderful book to look at. It's by Edgar Snow. It's called Red Star Over China. So he sat down with Mao over dozens of hours, and Mao relates his whole life to him, right? You know, the circumstances under which he grew up and all of that. For example, his father was initially what is called a small peasant, then eventually he acquires a little bit more land. He becomes what's known as a middle peasant. But even as a middle peasant, if you read the biography of Mao, you know that there were always shortages of food. Food was. I'm not talking here about famine so much as I'm really talking about the fact that there was very often hunger. Maybe not starvation, but there was certainly hunger. So Mao is born in Hunan in 1893. He's going to die in Beijing in 1976. He becomes part of a study circle. If you read again the biographies, they tell you that like any other Chinese boy in particular, in his early years, he basically grew up on the Confucian classics. Everybody grew up on the Confucian classics, and the difference is that Mao says that from early on he came to loathe Confucius. So when I was speaking about the disintegration of a Confucian Chinese civilization, you remember the Taipings that I'd spoken to about few minutes ago. So what we're seeing here is, again, a disenchantment with the old order. And Mao worked with his father in the fields. He's educated, but we wouldn't call him excessively educated. And in the area that he grew up with and in the circles that he eventually begins to cultivate, including these Marxist study circles, there is a hostility to commerce, to merchants. I think partly it had to do also with not only with Mao's own particular proclivities, but it also had to do, of course, with the fact that much of this commerce, not in the inland areas so much, but certainly in the coastal regions, and in the more so-called metropolitan centers, the Europeans had a substantial role to play in it. Right? In 1921, you have the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party in Shanghai. And in the meantime, in 1919, Sun Yat-Sen, whom I'd introduced to you earlier, he establishes what is known as the Kuomintang, or the Kuomintang, in English known as the Nationalist Party. And in 1924, the nationalists and the communists are going to forge an alliance. This alliance is not going to be very long-lived because eventually we're going to see the emergence of a civil war. And so if you go down here, you can see some of the developments that take place. And by 1929, you're going to have a civil war. Now, the context of the civil war, you have to remember, is that the old imperial system has collapsed. So if the old imperial system has collapsed in 1912, the question is, what kind of government are you going to have in power? And one fair way to think about this is to say that, in fact, there wasn't any kind of central government in China at this point at all. What you really have is you have the nationalists and you have the communists. And when we are saying the communists, of course, we are not looking at the great trajectory of how Mao and his entire circle came into acquaintance with the ideas of Marx. We'd have to start to look Marx and Engels, we'd have to start to look at the translations that were being done of the major texts, for example, into Chinese. Some of these people were lettered in English, and you have some cases of some Chinese who are intellectuals, members of the intelligentsia who have gone overseas and had either a smattering of French or German. But for the most part, you really would have had to read these, they read them mainly either in English or they read them in translation. All right? So 1929-30, when I say Civil War, I'm talking not only about the nationalists and the communists, but you also have areas of China which really are under what you might call the warlords. All right? It is in this context now that I want to spend 5-10 minutes looking at this remarkable text, which is the report issued by Mao, his report on the conditions of the peasantry in Hunan. And one thing you should notice immediately, let's supposing you got a question which asked you, what is the difference between how Mao and Marx think about revolution? Now recall that in the Communist Manifesto, Marx is talking about the workers, because Marx came from an urban background. He comes from an urban context. In fact, in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, as is the case in the Communist Manifesto, there is a line where he talks about what he calls, and I quote, the idiocy of the rural countryside. Right? That the Marxists, people like Marx himself, I mean, there was an unfamiliarity with peasant life. And there was, in fact, a contempt, you might say, almost, for the peasant. You know, the peasant as a country bumpkin, as a bovine character. Right? This was a considerable problem in many respects, because the question is, how do you reach out to the peasantry? How do you reach out to people who are working on the farms? And if you look at Mao, he's addressing not the workers, he's addressing the peasants. And that's one fundamental difference, that Western Marxism's origins are really, of course, in the context of the metropole, in the context of the great European cities, and therefore the urban proletariat, right? The industrial working class. Mao is not at this juncture thinking so much of the industrial working class. He's really thinking of the peasantry, right? So what does he do? He goes out, right from the outset, he says that what he did was he decided that he was going to conduct a first-hand investigation. And here again, by the way, you could say there's a difference between him and Marx, because Marx is going to eventually go to London, and he's going to spend the last 4 decades of his life in London, and he's going to be working at the British Museum, you know, poring over all of these books and manuscripts and all of that. And Mao is very much immersed in the countryside. He has a first-hand experience. At least that's how he relates it. Right? So he goes out to these areas to try to understand the nature of the peasant movement. This is, of course, a work that is extremely polemical, much like the Communist Manifesto. So I think of this as kind of the comparable polemical work if you're looking at the origins of Chinese communism. And this is one of the ways in which you might want to think about the report on the conditions of the peasantry in Hunan, right? So he's talking about the revolution of the peasants. And what is it that, if you had to recapitulate, what are some of the central arguments of this text? He's attacking what he calls the 4 systems of authority. The 4 systems of authority. Yeah? What are these 4 systems? The authority of the state, manifested for the peasants in local authority. So when we talk about the authority of the state, we're not talking about the authority at some central level. For the peasant, the authority of the state is represented by the local councillor, the town councillor, and so on. The authority of the clan, Because Mao is interested fundamentally in trying to understand how can the peasant be emancipated, be freed from the conditions in which he has been raised, right? From the conditions of the countryside, which is bleeding him, which is the source of his survival. It's what sustains him, but it's also what's bleeding him, right? So the authority of the clan, and he's referring to clan networks among the Chinese, right? And the authority of the temple is part of the authority of the clan, right? But he distinguishes theocratic authority separately, and that's the third authority. So the authority, when he says that, when I'm saying that this is a four-pronged attack against four-pronged notion of authority: authority of the state, authority of the clan, authority of the temple, or that is to say theocratic authority, which would include what you might describe as local deities. And fourthly, the authority of the husband, right? Patriarchal authority. And this text has something to say about all of these, right? So let me just look at a couple of passages with you, because we also want to get a little bit of the flavor of the text. And here again you can make comparisons with Marx and the flavor of the text there, which they're obviously areas of overlap. Both of them are rhetorical, they're polemical, but they're not simply polemical texts. There's a fine-grained analysis, as there was in the Communist Manifesto, where the theory of historical materialism, as I pointed out earlier, had not been worked out fully, right? And particularly the economic doctrines had not been worked out fully. So I had suggested to you then, when we last spoke about the Communist Manifesto, that you should really see it more as a treatise of history rather than as a treatise of economics, because the economic doctrines hadn't been worked out fully. And similarly, what you find in this case is that you don't find a fully worked out and articulated theory of revolution. But what he's going to speak about is how one should attack this authority, and then we have to understand what he thinks of as the nature of a revolution. The main targets of the attack by the peasants are the local tyrants, the evil gentry, and the lawless landlords. And notice again, now the particularity. Now he's not raising, as Marx is, the larger international context. Now, this is not an argument, workers of the world, unite. This is the peasants of Hunan, unite. That's really essentially what's going to emanate from this text over here. And when he says the evil gentry, the word that Marx uses is usually the bourgeoisie, right? So he's using the word gentry, and the landlords included that as well, the lawless landlords, because he's suggesting that these people really are a law unto himself. And then he says that now what's happened in the course of the last few years, this text is 1927, so he's saying in the last few years peasant associations have arisen, because remember, Chinese Communist Party had already been established by 1921. And so one of the things the party is going to start to do is it's going to start to infiltrate down into the countryside, right? And you know that by the late 1920s, the Chinese Communist Party has a paid membership of well over 1.5 million. So these are going to become really mass organizations that we're really looking at, right? And so he says that when these peasant associations come about, what you're going to see is that now suddenly the gentry are full of fear, and the middle peasants are now coming and saying, well, can we join the association? Because they want to try to see if they can have a safety net for themselves. Because there is an awareness of the fact that, well, maybe our lands will be looted or plundered, and so we want some kind of safety net. Now there's a section almost at the beginning, after a few pages, and it's an extraordinary section. It's called "It's Terrible" or "It's Fine," right? And then, what does he mean by that? Right? So the peasants' revolt disturbed the gentry's sweet dreams. Okay? And then he says, I met all sorts of people and picked up a good deal of gossip. So he's circulating, he's trying to understand what's taking place there. From the middle social strata upwards to the Kuomintang right-wingers, right? So the Kuomintang is the nationalist party. You can see here the civil war is already incipient. It hasn't formally broken out, but it's incipient because he's abusing the nationalists now. That this is a right-wing party, right? There was not a single person who did not sum up the whole business in the phrase, "It's terrible." Right? So he's saying that these rich peasants and middle peasants, the gentry, the landlords, they're saying it's terrible what's happening. You know, the peasants are rising up and they're making certain demands, right, under the impact of the views of the "it's terrible" school. So it's terrible school is all of these rogues and rascals, as he describes them, who are part of the gentry, right? What they're trying to do is they're trying to subvert the revolutionary intentions, the revolutionary mindset of the peasants. The patriarchal feudal class of local tyrants, evil gentry, and lawless landlords, that same phrase is going to recur repeatedly, has formed the basis of autocratic government for thousands of years and is a cornerstone of imperialism, warlordism, and corrupt officialdom. To overthrow these feudal forces is the real objective of the national revolution. Right? And you know, if you were one of these people who's been working on Marxism for 3 decades or 4 decades, then you begin to say, well, let's try to understand what exactly Mao meant by feudalism, because was he using a category from the European experience to understand the nature of agricultural relations, land relations, so forth and so on in China itself, right? In a few months, the peasants have accomplished what Dr. Sun Yat-Sen wanted but failed to accomplish in the 40 years he devoted to the national revolution. This is a marvelous feat, never before achieved, not just in 40, but in thousands of years, right? So this is what I mean by this, you know, there's this sense that, there's this new millenarian movement. What's happening here hasn't happened in thousands of years. And I'm coming forward as a messiah. That's, in a sense, what Mao is really saying. It's fine. It's fine. It's not terrible at all. So what he's doing here is what you might call inversion. Okay? And when I say inversion, what I'm talking about is what happens when the world gets turned upside down. So the next section is called the question of going too far. Okay? Then there is another section of people who say, yes, peasant associations are necessary, but they are going rather too far. Right? So now he's saying that there are people who are, this is the liberals who are saying, well, you know, these peasant, yes, we understand the grievances of the peasants, but they have to be moderate in their demands. They should be restrained. Right? They shouldn't go berserk. There should be some semblance of law and order that should be left. Right? Doing whatever they like and turning everything upside down. They have created a terror in the countryside. And then he's going to reinforce this over and over again. Now, let me suggest one thing here very briefly, which is that if you're looking at, because what is he talking about? What he's talking about is a peasant insurgency, right? These peasants have risen up. And this is a little theoretical here, but this is a way for you to understand how we might think about peasant insurgencies and how these insurgencies, in fact, actually spread, right? So one of the ways in which they spread is negation. What are their characteristics of a peasant insurgency? When Mao talks about the world turned upside down, inversion, the landlord is reduced to the state of a peasant, the peasant moves up, where you reverse the hierarchy, all right? Ambiguity, okay? One of the characteristics we have to understand is this. This is not so much a characteristic of peasant insurgency, it's a characteristic of the discourse around peasant insurgency. What do I mean by this? What I mean very simply is this, that the state and the agents of the state are always going to characterize such things as crime. If you want to take a political action by this what does the state do? The state will try to characterize it as a law and order problem. So for example, if you have a black uprising, let's say in this country, right? And 1960s is a good period. We're going to look at the 1960s later on. Now the 1960s was a period when you had obviously the civil rights movement, right? But some people use the cover of the movement. Remember my argument before to you that when you look at political, for example, under the cover of the war, genocide was committed. So this is what I mean by the notion of cover. That under the cover of the civil rights movement, there were doubtless some black people who probably engaged in petty theft and petty crime. Right? But on the other hand, what the state will always try to do is it will try to minimize serious political disturbances, right? Signs of political unrest, political dissatisfaction as ordinary crime, because it's a way of trivializing it. It's a way of simply saying that, no, these people are not motivated by ideological considerations. They're simply engaging in theft and crime, right? So this ambiguity is always there, and that's what Mao is going to be very alive to this. Right? Modality means specific targets. What we're talking about, how do peasant insurgencies spread? So, for example, in India, when you had the 1857-1858 rebellion about which I'd spoken to you before, many of the rebels targeted certain buildings specifically. It's not like they simply go and say, we're going to burn down everything. No. For example, you burn down the office of the landlord. You burn down the revenue office, because that's where all the revenue records are kept, all right? And solidarity. So this is what Mao is speaking about here. He goes to all of these places. He finds that these peasant associations are all now linking with each other, right? And transmission. How did the peasants in 1927, in a country like China, at this point in time, there would have been no infiltration even of the radio. Right? The radio was just coming. 1920s, you're going to begin to see the emergence of the radio in countries such as the United States and then Germany. And by 1930s, of course, it's fairly widespread. But when you're talking about the Chinese countryside in 1927, how was the word passed around that there's going to be an insurgency, that we want to mobilize people? This is an extraordinarily interesting question, how mobilization takes place in a rebellion or a revolution, right? And then the question of territoriality, how far does the insurgency spread? So here, and that's why Mao begins by telling you all the different areas of Hunan province that he went to, because he's trying to suggest to you that this is not restricted to one small area of Hunan, that my report covers all of these areas, and in all of these areas there is a very considerable peasant movement, right? And then one last paragraph, because this is whatever one thinks about the political shortcomings of communism or Marxism, but one of the most interesting things is the sheer rhetorical power of these texts. And I cannot refrain, in concluding my discussion of Mao here, we're going to get back then to the Civil War, but I cannot refrain from quoting to you this extraordinary, marvelous passage from this text. And he says, a revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery, right? And a revolution is a mighty thing. It's not like just sitting around at home and, thinking to yourself, and when I hear WKPFK, with which I'm very sympathetic, it's the local, quote, left-wing radio station, one of their programs is called Uprising. What uprising are they talking about? There's no uprising going on anywhere, even remotely close to an uprising, right? All you've got is reactionaries, right? Or, you do a little painting, Mao is saying, and you think, or you're doing post-colonial theory, and you think you're actually changing the world with it. I mean, he says, a revolution is not a dinner party or writing an essay or painting a picture or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. Heads are going to fall when there's a revolution. People are going to pay a price. And of course, the question you have to ask yourself relentlessly is that once you have this point of view, however wonderful it seems, then if you take it to excess, then what you have is sometimes genocide. Right? A revolution is not a picnic party, it's not embroidery, it's not a painting. What it is people losing their heads. But what if these heads turn out to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions? And I think you have to bear that in mind, because in 1958 to 62, China is going to go through a famine with 40 million people are going to die. 40 million. And, for decades, no one even talked about it because, well, it's a famine. Well, we now know. We've known this for some period of time. And Mao was very much in power at that time. In fact, he was the locus of all power. We know that the Chinese Communist Party knew what was happening in the countryside. They knew what was happening in all the provinces. They knew about the shortages of food. And they did nothing. And they did nothing. Why? Because a revolution is not a piece of embroidery. You understand what I mean? What I'm saying is that the Chinese Communist Party took the view. Mao took the view in 1958, moving into the next 2-3 years, when all these reports were coming in of acute starvation, that it's perfectly fine. It's fine because, frankly, this is one way in which nature works out certain problems. We already have an excess population. The ones who are going to die are the ones who are like flies anyhow, right? Now, no one describes this as a kind of Nazism, but maybe we should. Maybe we should. We should think about what are all the ways in which man's ingenuity has dreamed up the massacre of the innocents. Right? That's really what we're talking about here. All right? So even as I'm expressing an extraordinary, admiration for a passage or an interest in a passage, I'm saying, well, if we try to pursue its logical implications, then we may end up understanding what is it that transformed China later on in ways that were extremely detrimental to a large percentage of its population. So now when this civil war is going to go on, you also have what is called probably the most famous incident, or rather we might say the most famous phenomenon from the life of Mao, which makes him really legendary, is what's called the Long March, which takes place 1934 to 35. And what it is if you'll have the slide so you can look at it here, but eventually you're going to have, you have the Chinese Communist, the army, the Red Army. There are a number of armies. You've got 4 armies here, and what you're going to have is in this civil war, you're going to find that these people are going to have to retreat, and this long march is a very long march which takes place all the way over from here to here. So we're moving from the southeast part of China to Shanxi province over here. This is going to be over the course of a year. And there are legendary accounts of how many mountain passes and rivers and all of that they had to cross in order to enter into an enclave where they were eventually safe. These areas that you see striped in red, these were communist enclaves, and the X over that indicates that they are overrun by the nationalist forces. So this is during the midst of the civil war that I've been mentioning to you. And it forces, when these enclaves are run over by the nationalist forces, they obviously have to retreat, and that's what you see, these dotted lines and arrows. Okay, but you can study this, as I said, in greater detail later on. So on the eve of World War II, what we have is what? A situation where you have a civil war. In the mid-1930s, you're going to have the Japanese occupation of places such as Manchuria. You're going to have, of course, this notorious, what is called the Rape of Nanking in 1937. And it's only really going to be shortly after the end of World War II. It's going to be sometime a little bit after the end of World War II that the Civil War is eventually going to be resolved in the favor of the communists. And that's what, of course, the modern split is between the PRC and Taiwan, right? So Taiwan is where the nationalists eventually retreated to, and mainland China is going to come under the rule of the Communist Party as the People's Republic of China. All right, so that more or less brings to an end this particular segment. Now, well, we're out of time. Okay, so we're going to have to start with Nazism in my next lecture.